I was admitted to the ER, and my two boyfriends found out about each other in the waiting room. The hallway outside the ER triage room felt colder than the air inside. I remember leaning my shoulder against the painted cinder block, keeping just enough pressure there to steady myself without looking like I needed it. The fluorescent lights above hummed in a thin, continuous tone that threaded through every other sound. The phone at the nurse's station, the rolling of carts, the occasional cough from the waiting room. My left side ached each time I inhaled, a tight, pulling pain under my ribs that made me keep my breath shallow. The gown they'd given me was too thin for the draft that slipped in each time the automatic doors opened at the far end of the corridor. I kept one hand on the adhesive pad stuck to my chest, thumb tracing the rough edge of the tape. My other hand curled around the plastic bracelet at my wrist, fingers catching on the small locking tab they'd snapped into place. I watched the barcode flash under the scanner whenever someone checked me in or out of a room. It felt like a new version of my name. From where I stood, half inside the triage doorway, I could see part of the waiting area. Plastic chairs bolted to the floor, families arranged in islands, each cluster orbiting its own crisis. A child sobbed in small, exhausted bursts somewhere near the vending machines. A man in work boots paced in front of the registration desk, the coins in his hand clinking whenever he turned too sharply. The air smelled like it does in every hospital I've ever been in. Disinfectant layered over old air conditioning and something fried drifting from the cafeteria. Standing hurt, but sitting hurt more. When I sat, the pain under my ribs squeezed upward in a way that made the back of my throat taste metallic. So I stayed on my feet, weight shifting from one socked foot to the other, rubber dots on the soles rasping softly on the tile. I was watching the automatic doors more out of distraction than expectation when they opened with their soft hydraulic sigh. A slice of night air slid in. Mark walked through first. Gray hoodie, dark jeans, the same black backpack he took everywhere. He scanned the room with that focused expression he used when he thought something might be seriously wrong. His eyes passed over the registration desk, the chairs, the hallway, and then stopped on me. His mouth tightened, his pace quickened. The doors hadn't finished their closing cycle before the sensor triggered again. They slid open a second time, admitting another figure moving with slower, more uncertain steps. Chris, work jacket still dusted with drywall near the cuffs, phone in his hand, screen lit. His thumb hovered above the last message I'd sent. I'm at the ER. Not sure what's happening yet. Please don't freak out. I didn't decide to move. My body did it for me. I took one step back toward the triage door, fingers tightening around the bracelet until I felt the edges dig into my skin. Two men, walking toward the same point, both of them sure they were the one who was supposed to be there. They saw each other halfway between the entrance and the chairs. I watched the change in Mark's face first. A narrowing of the eyes, a small, almost imperceptible shift in his jaw. Chris's confusion unfolded in stages, like he was processing what he saw as if it were a misprint he needed to read twice. He looked at me, then at Mark, then back at me, and some part of him caught up to what his eyes were showing him. They both turned toward me at the same time. I felt their attention hit like a second diagnosis. The nurse at the front desk called out a last name that wasn't mine. A monitor down the hall beeped twice, corrected, returned to its regular rhythm. Overhead, the fluorescent lights flickered once. No one else seemed to notice. Neither of them moved. The ache under my ribs pulsed in a way that had nothing to do with bile ducts or organ tissue. I gripped the edge of the wall, fingertips pressing into the paint. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the recognition that something I'd been balancing by instinct had finally tipped in plain view. On the far wall, near the waiting room entrance, the stainless steel panel of a fire extinguisher cabinet caught the light. The surface was slightly warped, cheap metal bending at the edges. In it, I saw our three shapes, my thin figure in the gown, and behind me, two taller silhouettes, all of us distorted and framed in red. That reflection lodged in my mind faster than any of the medical information that followed. It looked like the real arrangement of the night, not patient and visitors, but a small, unintended constellation with me in the center. I remember thinking very clearly that I should have expected this. And then the triage nurse called my name, slightly mispronouncing the last syllable, and everything started moving again. It started with laundry. I know that sounds small compared to everything else, but that's where the timeline begins if I'm honest. Late afternoon, I was kneeling on the living room floor, sorting clothes into uneven piles. I remember the texture of the carpet under my knees, flattened, a little rough, and the feeling of a sweatshirt slipping out of my hands when the first wave of pain hit under my right ribs. It was sharp enough to make me stop, but brief enough that I thought it might be a pulled muscle. I stayed still, waited. The second wave came deeper, like someone was pinching a part of me I didn't know existed. I sat with my back against the couch and watched the digital clock on the cable box shift from 6:16 to 6:17 p.m. I took my phone from the coffee table and opened the Notes app. I typed, right upper abdominal pain, sudden, 6:17 p.m. I wrote it down the way I write down everything that feels like it might matter. Screenshots, dates, times, phrasing. I've always liked the idea that if something hurts, there should be proof it exists. When the pain didn't ease after 20 minutes, and instead started to pulse in regular intervals that made me brace my hand against my side, I decided to go to urgent care. It felt measured, less dramatic than an ER, more responsible than ignoring it. The urgent care clinic smelled faintly like carpet cleaner and something floral sprayed earlier and forgotten. The receptionist took my ID and insurance card, fingers clicking steadily on the keyboard. The intake nurse wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm and asked the standard questions. When she pressed under my right rib, my body betrayed me with a sharp inhale. She didn't say much. She just wrote more on the clipboard. I watched her pen move. Ryukyu pain, nausea, mild, onset, 18-17. When she handed me the referral slip, I saw the line she'd written at the top in small, neat letters. Rule out gallbladder involvement. Possible complications. Imaging's closed here for the night, she said. ER has ultrasound on. You should go in. In the car afterward, the pain flared each time I turned the steering wheel. I sat in the parking lot with the engine idling and looked at the slip. The words possible complications stood out more than they should have. I opened my messages before I fully decided what I was going to say. I texted Mark first because his thread was already near the top. We'd spoken around noon about his day. I typed, I'm at the ER. Not sure what's happening yet. Please don't freak out. I added, please, because I knew his version of worry involved practical solutions I couldn't handle yet. Then I tapped over to Chris's thread. Our last conversation was about a drywall delivery that had been delayed at his job and a joke about him never escaping construction dust. I typed the exact same message. No edits, no variation. 2 lines sent into 2 separate lives that never overlapped. I know how that sounds. I also know that in that moment my thinking shrank down to something simple. If this is serious, someone should know where I am. I just chose 2 someones. I didn't picture them converging. At the ER, triage was efficient. ID, insurance, bracelet. They gave me a gown and small plastic bag for my clothes. The triage nurse, whose badge read Delia Kova LPN, pressed on my abdomen, watched my face, didn't say anything dramatic but wrote more on her clipboard. She had the kind of neutral voice people develop when they've seen every version of panic already. Bays are full, she said after taking my vitals. We'll keep you in the hall until something opens up. That's how I ended up standing by the wall outside the triage room, watching the clock shift every few minutes, feeling my phone buzz in the pocket of my gown. Mark, I'm coming. Which entrance? Chris, are you alone? Do you want me there? I didn't answer either. Choosing one would have meant defining what we were in a way I'd avoided for months. The pain made my usual rationalizations feel flimsy, but not flimsy enough to collapse them completely. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and decided I would answer once I knew whether this was something minor or the kind of problem that rearranges your calendar. 10 minutes later, they both walked through the same sliding doors. The hospital solved my indecision by brute force. In the exam bay, I watched them take up positions without needing to be asked. Mark gravitated toward the left side of the bed, near the counter and sink, like he wanted to stay close to whatever equipment might be used. Chris ended up on the right, near the chair, closer to where I could see him without turning my head too much. The nurse asked which one of them was my ride home. The silence that followed felt louder than the IV pump or the monitor. Their eyes flickered briefly toward each other and then landed on me. We'll see after the tests, I said. It was the nearest thing to the truth I could manage. While the nurse took my blood pressure, I watched both of them over the cuff. Mark's mouth was a straight line. Chris's thumb rubbed a pattern over the side of his phone without him seeming to notice. If you want to know what kind of person I am, it's there, in that moment. 2 men in the same room because of me, and a part of my attention still cataloging their reactions instead of focusing on my own body. The doctor, navy scrubs, badge clipped askew, came in, pressed on my abdomen, ordered tests. His questions were routine: medications, allergies, surgical history. As I answered, I could feel both men filling in their own silent versions of my life. I'd been seeing Mark for a little over a year. He worked in IT support at a mid-sized company, the kind of job that made him very good at troubleshooting practical frustrations. He fixed things without making a big show of it. He was the one who replaced the broken latch on my kitchen window and sent me links to articles when my car made a noise I couldn't describe. I'd met Chris 8 months after Mark and I started whatever we were. Chris worked on renovation crews, moved between job sites, came home at odd hours with dust on his clothes and a kind of restlessness I recognized in myself. What started with a drink after a mutual friend's birthday turned into something with a rhythm of its own. I never used the word relationship out loud with either of them. I let the routines define themselves. With Mark, it was Wednesday dinners and Sunday afternoons. With Chris, it was late nights after his shifts, showing up with takeout. Both of us too tired to pretend we weren't just looking for a place to land. It wasn't that I didn't know what I was doing, it's that I refused to name it. Naming things makes them harder to adjust. The first real crack in the silence came after the ultrasound, while we waited for the CT results. The doctor had explained the blood work. White count elevated, liver enzymes off, and the ultrasound, suggestive of inflammation. Then he left to review the CT himself. As soon as the curtain swayed shut behind him, Mark leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, and looked directly at me. His voice stayed even, but the words came out differently from anything he'd said to me before. "How long have you been seeing him?" He didn't look at Chris when he said it. He looked only at me, as if the answer wasn't really about the other man at all. Chris straightened in his chair. "You say that like you're the one she owes the explanation to," he said. Still keeping his tone low, mindful of the thin curtain, Mark turned his head slowly. "You didn't know I existed," he said. "So I'd say we both deserve one." They weren't yelling. They weren't making a scene. That's the thing that kept it inside the realm of the real for me. They argued the way people do when they're very aware of being in a shared space. Sharp, compressed, contained. Chris's jaw tightened. He looked at me, then back at Mark. "How long?" Mark repeated, this time not taking his eyes off me. I could have lied. I thought about it. I could have shaved months off one or the other, made the overlap smaller, more forgivable. That would have been the old pattern. Adjust the facts just enough to make myself easier to accept. Something about being hooked up to monitors made me answer plainly. "Almost a year," I said. "With you. 8 months with him." I didn't specify which pronoun attached to which timeline. They both could do the math. Chris exhaled through his nose, like someone who'd just taken a hit to the chest and was trying not to show it. "So, you started with him," he said, jerking his chin toward Mark, and then added me in. The phrasing bothered me more than it should have. "It wasn't like that," I said. "It wasn't a calculation." Mark gave a small, humorless sound that didn't quite become a laugh. "You thought you were managing 2 different situations," he said. "You just didn't plan for a room with 1 bed." I remember every word because I've replayed them since, checking my own reactions like symptoms. When the transport aide arrived to take me to CT, both men moved out of the way without being asked. As I was wheeled down the corridor, I saw them reflected together in one of the glass panels on the wall, their shapes slightly elongated by the curve of the surface. It reminded me of the fire extinguisher cabinet. My mind collects reflections like some people collect diagnoses. The CT machine didn't care about my personal history. It cared about density and contrast. The tech asked me to lie still, injected the dye, warned me about the warm flush. The ring of the machine circled my body with mechanical indifference. For the duration of the scan, I wasn't a node in a triangle, just a collection of tissues and fluids being imaged for irregularities. Afterward, the hallway back to the bay felt longer. My abdomen felt heavier, like the knowledge of the inflammation had weight. When we rolled in, Mark and Chris were standing in the same positions as before, but closer to each other than I'd left them, as if the space had shrunk. The aide left. The curtain settled. "That's almost a year," Chris said quietly, picking up the thread like no time had passed, "of letting both of us think we were something." He didn't finish the sentence. I filled it in silently for both of them. "I didn't promise exclusivity to either of you," I said. It was the closest thing I had to a defense. And even as I said it, I heard how thin it sounded. "No," Mark said. "You just didn't mention that when you said you were free 3 nights a week, one of those nights already belonged to someone else." That was fair. I don't say that to make myself look balanced. I say it because part of this is confession. There's no point in lying on paper when the room already saw the truth. I saw a lot in their faces in that moment. Hurt, certainly. Confusion. Something like insult, but deeper. And underneath, if I'm being completely honest, something that curled at the edges of my own awareness. Proof. Proof that 2 different people had been invested enough to show up, to sit through hours in a fluorescent-lit room, to argue for their place in a conversation that centered on me. I don't feel proud admitting that. I also won't pretend it didn't register. The official turning point, according to the chart, was the CT result confirming acute cholecystitis. According to me, it was what happened afterward. The doctor came back with the printout. He explained that the gallbladder was inflamed, that there were signs of early complication, that they recommended laparoscopic removal the next morning. He listed the risks in steady, practiced sentences: bleeding, infection, injury to surrounding structures. The words sat on the paper in small print while I signed my name underneath them. When he left, the curtain closed again, and it was just the 3 of us and the steady beep of the monitor. This time, it was Chris who spoke first. His voice wasn't loud, but there was a new edge to it. "If something had gone really wrong," he said, nodding toward the door the doctor had just exited, "who were they supposed to call? Him? Me? Both of us?" The question was logical. It still felt like an accusation. "My mother's listed as my emergency contact," I said. "Neither of you are on the forms?" It was the truth. I'd never updated that paperwork because updating it would have meant picking a name. That's worse, Mark said, not looking at me now, eyes fixed on some point near the foot of the bed. You wanted the benefits of having two people without the responsibility of acknowledging either of us officially. He wasn't wrong. That's the problem with people who see systems for a living. They can point out the structure in your behavior better than you can. I didn't cry. I didn't apologize in a way that would satisfy anyone watching. I sat there with a plastic IV line taped to my hand and thought about how I'd built my life on delays. Conversations I would have once things settled, choices I would make when it felt like the right time. The right time had apparently decided to show up in an ER bay with 2 chairs and 1 narrow bed. Sometime after that, fatigue flattened everything. The nurse came to transfer me upstairs. The ride in the elevator was quiet. They followed me to the surgical floor, stopped at the double doors they weren't allowed to pass, made calm promises to be there when I came back. I believed them. I also knew that belief was based on a version of me that was starting to dissolve under hospital light. I won't linger on the surgery itself. It's all anesthesia and blankness, a gap in the story. What matters for this confession is what I woke up into. When they rolled me back into the med-surg room, both men were there, sitting in the same chairs, less composed now. Mark's hair was flattened on one side as if he'd fallen asleep against the wall. Chris's eyes were bloodshot. They both stood when they saw me, careful, like approaching an animal that might spook. The nurse updated my pain scale numbers, checked the incisions, made notes on the chart at the foot of the bed. Lap Chol completed 0942, tolerating PO fluids. She left us with the standard instruction to call if I needed anything. The first thing I noticed about myself, aside from the ache, was that I felt lighter. Not emotionally, physically. The pressure under my ribs that had defined the last 24 hours was gone, replaced by the sharp, localized pain of surgical wounds. There was relief in that. I won't pretend there wasn't. The second thing I noticed was how fast I started sorting what had happened into narrative pieces. This is something people don't tell you about nearly being cut open. If your brain is wired like mine, it starts composing the story of it almost before the anesthesia wears off. I watched them watching me. I saw the concern, the anger held in reserve, the tiredness. And behind all that, I saw their competing claims to the same space. All day, between nurse visits and walk attempts, they took turns in an unspoken pattern. One would step out to get coffee, the other would stay. When the rounding team came, they both quieted and moved to the edges. When visiting hours started to near their end, they both shifted in their chairs, restless. The final conversation wasn't a dramatic showdown. It was more like triage, deciding what to leave for later and what to address while everyone was still in the same room. When you're home, Mark said, standing by the window, eyes on the parking lot below, you're going to have to decide if you want either of us in your life or neither, but not both of us like this. He didn't turn around when he said it. It felt more like he was issuing a directive to the glass. Chris sat back in his chair, arms folded loosely across his chest. I'm not going to fight you for her, he said. I'm tired. If she wants me, she can say so. If she doesn't, that's an answer too. Their words should have felt like an ultimatum. Instead, they felt like relief. For months, I'd been bracing silently for the moment when someone would finally make me pick a lane. Here it was, wrapped inside hospital hours and pain meds. I'll think about it, I said. When I'm not half numb and full of whatever they've got in this IV, I'll talk to each of you. Even now, I hear how non-committal that sounds. It was the best I could do while still wanting to keep all options available. They accepted that, or at least didn't contest it. They left separately, both telling me to rest, both telling me to text when I got home, both leaving with the same mix of resentment and worry. The nurse came in to check my vitals after they were gone. My heart rate was a little high. She wrote it down as post-op pain. She wasn't wrong exactly. She just didn't have a code for the other kind. Discharge the next morning was a series of boxes to check. A nurse removed my IV and secured a gauze pad with tape, gave me a stack of papers to sign, asked me to repeat back the medication instructions. A volunteer wheeled me to the entrance. I watched the triage hallway pass by again, the fire extinguisher cabinet reflecting different people this time. Our 3 distorted shapes were gone, but I saw them layered faintly over the new faces in my mind, like a double exposure. Outside, the light was too bright. I walked carefully to my car, feeling each step tug at the sutures under my ribs. The parking lot smelled like asphalt warming in the sun. When I sat in the driver's seat, I stayed there with the door open for a full minute, breathing in a measured way. The folder with my discharge instructions lay on the passenger seat. I opened it and scanned the pages. Wound care, diet progression, activity limits. A line reminding me of my follow-up appointment. Thursday, 10:45 a.m., bring ID. My name appeared at the top of each page, printed in the same font as hundreds of other names that day. There was something grounding about that. Before I started the engine, I picked up my phone. The lock screen was full of missed notifications, messages from both men, from my mother, from work. I swiped them away without reading the contents yet. It felt like too much input. At the top of the screen, a small arrow icon caught my eye. When I pulled down the notification shade, a line of text sat under other alerts. Location sharing in background. That shouldn't have stood out. Plenty of apps use location. But there was a strange stillness in the car, and my mind grabbed onto the detail the way it had grabbed onto the time of my first pain, or the code at the bottom of the consent form. I tapped it. The settings menu opened to a list of people under a heading I hadn't looked at in months. At the top was my own name. Below that, in smaller text, sharing your location with one person. I tapped it. The next screen showed a single name. Mark Halden. Can see your location, indefinitely. Underneath, a date indicated when the sharing had started. 9 months ago. I tried to remember what we'd done that day. Dinner at his place, I think. I remembered handing him my phone to cue music or check driving directions. I did not remember agreeing to let him track me. Maybe he'd mentioned it. Maybe he'd said something like, just in case. Maybe I'd nodded, half listening, already thinking about something else. I'm not claiming I was drugged or tricked. I'm saying I hadn't really considered the implications until that moment. The map view showed my recent locations. 2 days of lines, little circles where I'd stopped, home, work, grocery store, the urgent care clinic, then the hospital, a bright marker indicating where my phone currently sat, in my car, in the parking lot after being discharged. I stared at it for a long time. People talk about being violated when they discover something like that. I wish I could say that was my first and overwhelming reaction. It wasn't. What I felt, at least in the first few seconds, was something closer to fascination. Here was a precise visual record of my movements, tied to a person who had walked into the ER less because of my text, and more because he could see my dot settle at a hospital and not move. Proof again. Proof that someone had been paying very close attention to where I was, even when my messages were vague. Proof that the coincidences I'd brushed off, the time he'd shown up at the same grocery store without being told, the way he'd texted late night, when I stayed out later than usual, had been anchored to something more concrete than intuition. After the fascination came anger. Yes, but it came braided with something else I'm not proud of, a sense of centrality. I had spent months arranging my life so that I sat at the center of two people's attention without ever looking too closely at the method. Now one of those methods was laid out in a clean interface. I tapped the 3 dots in the corner and selected Stop Sharing. The app asked if I was sure. I confirmed. The line under his name changed from indefinitely to stopped. It felt like closing a file. I scrolled to see if anyone else was listed. No other names appeared. Chris had never asked to share locations. He'd just shown up when I invited him. There was a difference there that I registered even then. I put the phone face down on the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove home. In the days that followed, when the worst of the pain settled into a manageable ache, I did something that might sound responsible at first. I made lists. In the notebook by my bed, I wrote 3 columns: medical, practical, personal. Under medical, I detailed my wound care, my medication schedule, my walking goals. I logged my temperature each night, writing numbers in a neat column. Under practical, I wrote, change emergency contacts at next appointment, review app permissions, update passwords, check social media privacy settings, turn off location sharing with anyone else by default. Under personal, I wrote just 2 names, Mark and Chris, leaving space under each for whatever decisions I would eventually make. It looked methodical. It was methodical. What it wasn't was remorseful, not in the way people expect when you've hurt others. I didn't spend long nights castigating myself. I didn't rehearse apologies in the mirror. I thought about impact, yes, but I also thought about leverage. When Mark texted the next day, "You made it home okay?" I waited an hour before replying. It wasn't out of cruelty. It was to see how it felt not to respond immediately, to break the habit of availability. I replied, home, sore, thanks for being there. I didn't mention the location sharing. That was a card I chose not to play yet. You might think that's cowardly. You're probably right. It also preserved my advantage in the conversation. His response came almost immediately. Anytime. Want company later this week? I stared at the screen and realized that for all the righteous anger he'd expressed in the room, he still wanted to be invited back into it. That told me something important about the balance between us. Chris's first message after I got home was longer, full of check-ins and small jokes designed to make me smile. I answered him more quickly, partly because his tone didn't demand anything from me yet. We'll talk, I wrote at the end. Just need to get through follow-up first. I know how this reads. I know the arc people expect here, that nearly losing part of my body would jolt me into clarity, that being confronted by 2 men in the same hospital room would force a moral pivot. I thought that might happen too. I thought maybe pain plus exposure would equal transformation. What actually happened was quieter and, I think more accurate to who I am. I became more careful, not kinder, not more honest in the way they would define it, just sharper. At my follow-up appointment, Dr. Belcourt inspected the incisions, pressed gently around the healing tissue, asked about pain levels. He was satisfied. He signed a form clearing me to return to normal activity in 2 weeks. On the way out, the receptionist asked me to confirm my emergency contact information. I changed my mother's number to my own cell, listed as self. I left the second line blank. Back at home, I went through my phone settings one by one. I revoked location access from apps that didn't need it. I checked privacy settings on my social media accounts. I archived the message threads with both men for an afternoon just to see what my home screen looked like without them. It was quiet. It was also spacious. The conversations we'd promised did happen separately over the next week. I won't detail them here, not because I'm sparing feelings, but because they were predictable. They said the things people say when they realize you've been splitting your attention. They asked me why. They wanted assurance it wouldn't happen again in some future version of us. I didn't give them that assurance. I said I didn't know yet what I wanted. I said I needed time with myself, which is one of those phrases that sounds mature while being completely non-committal. I left both doors open just enough that neither of them could say I'd slammed it. For a while, that felt like growth, choosing not to choose, stepping back, focusing on my recovery, my routines, my own space. Then, one night, weeks later, I caught my reflection in the dark surface of the living room window, backlit by the TV, phone in my hand, thumb hovering over a new notification from a dating app I'd reinstalled just to look. My silhouette looked familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. I saw the outline of the ER reflection superimposed over it. Me in the center, other people blurred at the edges, all of us slightly distorted by the surface we were caught in. That's the closest thing I've had to a real turning point. Not the surgery, not the confrontation, not the discovery of the location tracking. Just a moment on my couch, half-healed, realizing that the shape of my life hadn't changed as much as I wanted to believe. Here is the part that makes this, truly, a confession. I didn't delete the app. I didn't send long, heartfelt apologies and commit to solitude until I'd worked on myself. I matched with someone new 2 days later. I told myself I was just talking, just seeing, just keeping my options open. I am very good at just. I did eventually tell Mark that I'd found the location sharing. I framed it as a boundary issue, which it was, and used it as a reason to step back from seeing him. He apologized, said he'd only meant it for safety, that he'd forgotten it was still on. I believed him. That didn't mean I forgave it. It did give me a clean narrative to exit on, one where he'd crossed a line and I'd taken control. With Chris, the exit was softer. We drifted. I stopped answering every message. He got busier at work. Timing became the villain we could both blame. No one had to be the bad person. Out loud anyway. If there's a villain in this, it's me. Not in the cinematic sense. No dramatic monologues, no shattered glass, but in the quieter, more persistent way of someone who keeps choosing herself as the central figure and arranging everyone else around that axis. People like to end stories like mine with growth. They want a final paragraph about learning to be alone, about rethinking patterns, about healing. The truth is, I did heal, physically. The scars under my ribs faded from angry red to pale lines that only I notice now. I can eat greasy food if I want to, though I usually don't. The hospital smell doesn't follow me unless I summon it. My patterns? They didn't vanish. They became more efficient. I keep better records now. Of my symptoms, my appointments, my passwords, my conversations. I know exactly who has access to my location at any given time. No one, unless I decide otherwise. I know how to stop sharing with a tap. I know how to archive entire threads without deleting them. Sometimes I think about that night in the ER, about the way both men looked at each other when they realized what I'd done, and I try to feel the kind of remorse people write about in articles. Sometimes I manage it. More often, what I feel is a detached kind of curiosity, like watching a case study of myself from the outside. If this were a different kind of story, I would say that nearly losing an organ taught me how to live more honestly. The real lesson was simpler, and I don't expect it to sound flattering. What I learned is how far people will go to stand in a fluorescent-lit hallway for you, what they'll overlook, what they'll fight through, how much of themselves they're willing to place quietly at the foot of your bed, and how easy it is, once you've seen that, to start measuring every new person by whether they'd do the same. The light in my apartment hallway doesn't hum the way the hospital's did. It's soft, warm, forgettable. Most nights I walk past it without noticing, but sometimes when I catch my reflection in the dark TV screen or the oven door, I see a faint echo of that warped metal panel. 3 figures frozen in a moment I created by omission. I don't look away anymore. I just watch, memorizing the angle of my own face in the center. If you're waiting for the part where I say I'm going to change, I don't have that for you. What I have is a set of facts. I lived, I chose, other people got hurt, and I am still arranging my life in a way that keeps me at the focal point. Sometimes I think that's the real complication they should put on the discharge forms, the kind that doesn't show up on any scan, but lives instead in how you tell the story afterward, and who you let into the next waiting room. The seatbelt still clicks the same way when I fasten it across my chest. The engine still hums when I turn the key. The road still opens up in front of me in long, measured lines. And I am still in the driver's seat watching the mirrors, deciding who gets to follow, knowing exactly how it looks, and choosing it anyway.